Have you ever felt like life just wasn't fair? Now, I'm not talking about what we deem unjust or unfair or undeserved, like illness and sudden death. That's an entirely different discussion in a sermon you need to come back for. I'm talking about a time that when you stood up for what was right, and you become the victim. It happened on the 23rd of February of 155. His name was Polycarp. He was the bishop in the town of Smyrna. And as a young man, he had been a disciple of John, the apostle. But he was no longer a young man. As a matter of fact, he was 86 years old. So on February the 23rd would be his last day to live. Through the years of Christians of Smyrna had come upon persecution, and this time it was no different. Public opinion had been stirred against the Jesus followers, and the Roman governor was going to take action. As a matter of fact, it provided a great opportunity for them to please the crowd and entertain them at the same time. And so the Christians would be brought into a stadium and executed in any number of ways. But the favorite of the crowd was for the Christians to be fed to some wild beasts. And the cry went up from the crowd for the leader of the Christians, Polycarp, to be brought for execution. Story goes that when the Roman troops arrived at the bishop's home, he asked to be allowed to pray alone for an hour before he was taken away. At that same time, he ordered the best food and drink available to be brought to those who were waiting there to arrest him. Needless to say, that was probably a big surprise to the soldiers. Tradition tells us that Polycarp was led into the arena to meet his fate. That a voice from heaven was heard and said, "Be strong, Polycarp, play the man." And play the man he did. When the Roman governor was confronted with this senior citizen, he wasn't sure what to do with an 86-year-old. It hardly seemed sporting to feed him to lions. And as he offered him a chance to recant, "Deny Christ," he said, "and I'll let you go free." He looked at him. He said, "Deny Christ? I have served him 86 years, and in no way has he dealt me unjust with me. So how can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" Wow. Well, the governor tried again. "Okay, at your age and wisdom, praise Caesar. Change your mind and say, away with these atheists." But he looked at the people around and waved his hands as he replied, "Away with the atheists." Not exactly the response that the governor was looking for. And then he said, "If you vainly expect that I will swear by Caesar's as you suggest and pretend to be ignorant about who I am, listen to what I openly say to everyone here. I am a Christian. If you want to learn the teachings of Christianity, name the date and hear about our belief." That was all that was needed. The governor demanded of Polycarp, "Don't you realize that I could have you thrown into wild beasts?" Polycarp said, "Go ahead." Well, if the old man wasn't afraid of a relatively quick death, maybe fire, something that would be slow and will burn him alive, could cause him problems. And of course, something would be better of having your head cut off, because a hot steak is always better than cold chop. Anyway, angry Jews and Gentiles had gathered wood for the pile. The bishop was led to the platform where the execution was to take place. And normally the prisoners would be nailed to the stake to secure them in place. I don't know what it was with Romans and nails anyway. We've talked a lot about that lately. But as they approached Polycarp with the hammer and nails, he said, "Let me be as I am. For he who makes it it possible for me to endure the fire will also make it possible for me to remain unmoved without the security of the nails. And he did. On that day, he died a martyr. Now maybe you're wondering, so what? Well, the so what is that history tells us that Polycarp was a disciple of John and that he was part of the church that the letter of the Revelations in general and the portion that Beth read earlier in particular was addressed to, the church in Smyrna. When I first read the account, I wondered if he remembered the words that had been read in his church's lifetime before. We're into the second of the seven. Perhaps that is simply an accident of geography, as it was the next city on the route for the messenger was to take. Or maybe it was designed that way. You see, if it were natural that Ephesus be the first city mentioned, then it is only proper that Jesus would speak to Smyrna next. The historians tell us that Smyrna was the most beautiful city in all of Asia. Almost like here in Switzerland. Wow. The city was referred to as flower of Asia, the crown of Asia, the jewel of Asia. Smyrna is the modern city of Izmir, about 35 miles north of Ephesus. It had an excellent harbor and was a wealthy city. It was also a commercial center for Asia Minor. It was on the direct trade route from India and Persia to Rome. Archaeologists have uncovered a large number of coins from all over the world, so it was a sign of wealth. And Smyrna had a strong allegiance to Rome. It became the first city in ancient world to build a temple in honor to the goddess of Rome. Smyrna also beat out 10 other cities for the privilege of building a temple to the Emperor Tiberius, who was installed the emperor worshiping through the Roman Empire. During John's time, Smyrna had the typical urban features you'd find in large cities: public marketplaces, temples, a library, a gymnasium, a stadium, and a theater. They had long been known for their devotion to Rome. Once a year, it was the duty of every Roman citizen to burn incense at the altar and to worship Caesar. What the individual would do was burn a little incense and say, "Caesar is Lord." But guess what? Christians refused to do that. So they suffered the consequences. And a lot of times that meant death. The gospel came to Smyrna as a result of Paul's evangelism during his third mission. Paul had told those believers years earlier to expect persecution. But Jesus had no criticism of the church at all. I can't believe that. I thought Beth missed the spot. There was only 50 kilometers away from the church of Ephesus that Jesus condemned for losing their first love. But he had no such complaint against this church. Instead, he focused on the faithfulness and specifically on how they've been faithful in the face of three distinct challenges. He confronted the church for what they were up against. He began by saying, "I know." There are two words translated to know. One means to know by observation. I know that if you miss a nail with your hammer, guess what? You're probably going to hit your thumb and it's going to hurt. Secondly, is to know by experience. You know how come I can say what I said earlier? I know because I've hit my thumb. That is the difference between observance or observation and experience. Jesus used the word to know by experience because he had been through it. He knew what they were experiencing. And here's the word of comfort, not only to them, but to you and I. He said, Jesus said, "I know about your suffering." Now, we've discussed a little bit about persecution of those early Christians. Christianity was seen as a sect of Judaism, which was a recognized religion. And so in the initial growth of the church, we see that the government sometimes would even step in and protect them. But things had changed. Caesar worship had become more normal. What the emperors had seen as an amusing piece of Christianity had got into becoming the norm. The emperors had seen as venerated because of the many benefits brought by the Roman Empire, and it was worship that they wanted. The same way we might worship a movie star or a pop idol. Princess Di, they've been viewed by many that way. However, when Domitian became emperor, he took Caesar worship more seriously and demanded it of everybody. When his proclamations were read, they begin with, "Our Lord and our God Domitian commands." And then it would go on from there. All over the empire, the decree was that everyone must utter the words, "Caesar is Lord." Christians might have lived in peace for a number of years, but then all of a sudden, the persecution would take off on them. And Jesus said that, "I see what's happening. I'm not oblivious to it all. I'm with you," as they were being persecuted. And then he said, "I know about your poverty." In Greek, there is two different words that are used for poverty. The first one, pina, it meant that you had nothing extra. We might say we're broke. We could only afford our basic cable, no features on our phone. It meant that if we were going to have a big celebration, I needed to go to McDonald's. The other Greek word that was used meant having nothing at all, being destitute. Person didn't have little, they had nothing. And that was the word that Jesus used here. Now I'm sure there was a little bit more than nothing, but probably not very much. There may have been a couple of explanations for the poverty, and Jesus knew this. One of the problems was in order to do business in Smyrna, you needed to have a little token which you could receive from the government each year for proclaiming that Caesar was Lord. But since Christians wouldn't proclaim that Caesar was Lord, they never got those tokens, which they couldn't shop at most stores or even own a store because they didn't have that to show. Yet Jesus tells them, even though you're dirt poor, in his eyes, you're rich. And the word Jesus used for rich was the idea of being in the position of power and authority because of wealth. Now that's strange sounding to me, but to Jesus, his followers were in the position of authority because of the treasures they were storing up in heaven. They were rich in the sight of God. They may be physically poor, but spiritually they were wealthy. For many people, this was the breaking point, because we value our prosperity. We value the fact that we can afford many luxuries on top of just necessities. How foolish we are to think that the little bit we accumulate here in life matters a whole lot in eternity. Will the God who made the universe be impressed by my 75-foot yacht? Will he be blown away by the mansion that I have for six bedrooms in it? Will he be impressed by all my cars? He laughs at all of our desires to be materially wealthy, I think. There's nothing wrong, I'll say, with being wealthy, and there's nothing wrong with money and possessions. I'm not trying to say that. But if they become our God, the driving force, what we focus on doing, that's where it becomes a problem. But we'll talk about that in another series. Jesus knows yours and my poverty, and he knows our riches also. He sees our faith lived out. He knows the prayers you pray for your tears. He hears your desperate cries for help. Life is not easy for Christians in that town. And yet Jesus reassures them that while they may be poor in material things, they're rich in spiritual things, which of course goes back to what Matthew said. Jesus said, don't store up treasures here on earth where they can be eaten by moths and get rusty, and where the thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven where they will never become moth-eaten or rusty. Where? I have to think of myself, what am I keeping and where am I storing my treasures? My safe, or in a safe deposit box at the bank. That may not be good enough. And then, his third thing he said was, I know about the slander. The sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Yeah, right. If you were like most children growing up, that was probably something we said all the time. And even though we repeated it, we didn't believe it. The power of words is incredible. And while the truth sometimes hurts, it's when the words spoken are lies that really hurt us, don't they? That was the problem with the church. The critics had nothing negative they could say about the church that was the truth, and so guess what they did? They fabricated some faults. There were 6 slanderous charges seemed to be go against this church. It's probably safe to assume that these were some of the lies that they were dealing with. On the basis of the words spoken during the communion service, this is my body, this is my blood, some say Christians practice cannibalism, which we're going to be doing here in a little bit, I guess. Did you know when the cannibal child was allowed to leave the table? Not till everyone was finished off. Because the early Christians referred to the communion meal as the agape, or the love feast, rumor circulated that there was an orgy going on with sexual immoralities. And it's true that Christians could separate families when one member was a believer and one wasn't. Christians were accused of tampering with family relations. They were only out to break up families. And the Romans accused Christians of being atheists because they couldn't understand a worship which had no image of a god. That the Romans worshipped at the temple. They dedicated and worshipped statues. They could see who they were worshiping. Because Christians refused to call Caesar Lord, they were considered treasonous, unpatriotic. Christians were accused of being arsonists because they talked about the fire at the end times. Hoping to destroy the Christian faith, some of the wealthy, influential Jews reported these false allegations to the Romans. So the church was commended by Jesus for what they experienced in terms of affliction, poverty, and slander, experienced trial and difficulty. But you know what? They still remained faithful to Jesus. And you thought you had it rough when people call you a holy roller. Here's the promise. Jesus says, God bless you when you are mocked, persecuted, and lied about because you are my followers. Again, the word is when, not if. It's when. So Jesus has said, I have seen that you've been persecuted, lied about, but there's good news. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer, because the devil's going to throw all sorts of things and throw a lot of you in prison and put you to the test. And you're going to be persecuted. Kind of cheer up, things could be worse. I cheered up, and sure enough, they got worse. Remember, Jesus had perfect knowledge about what was going on. He knew what has, what is, and what's going to happen. It might surprise me, but it doesn't surprise him. So how did the devil put some of the believers in jail. Well, they tell me they stirred up the Jews to work with the pagans, to stir up animosity. The term 10 days that Beth told us they would maybe suffer wasn't to be taken literally. What it meant was it was indefinite, or a set period of time. It won't last forever. But he said, remain faithful. Don't give up. Persevere. And then you win. You get to live forever without pain and without fear. Even if you're burned at the stake, even if you die a horrible disease, even if everyone abandons you, remain faithful. I can't explain why some people seem to suffer more than others. It just happens. But let us take comfort in this. If Jesus said that you will suffer for sin 10 days, no force on earth will make it last 11 days. It won't end early, but it won't go a lot longer than what Jesus said. And that's why he said, fear not. Be faithful, and I will give you the crown of life. And he concludes, he who has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. He reminded the faithful that while the first death is a physical death, the second death is what those who do not believe in Jesus will be subject to. It's what will happen to the devil, his angels, and his fathers. It's eternal separation from God. Jesus promised that those who are faithful isn't going to experience that death, but will have eternal life with him. He wants to encourage each one of us in what we're doing. He wants us to know that he's with us, and he's faithful in that, and he will do what he promises. When you're facing difficulties in life, try to rest assured Jesus is there with you. He knows what you're going through. Sometimes he offers an eternal reward if you'll just hold fast. Be encouraged. Don't run from the trouble of life. Embrace Jesus. He's here with us, with you. You are richer than you think. Remember that.
Amen.